The financial system for decades, the quiet scaffolding of American global power is cracking. The warning did not come from a conspiracy theorist or a geopolitical rival. It came directly from the International Monetary Fund, an institution founded and largely controlled by the very powers whose dominance is now in question. The headline IMF warns deepening fragmentation between power blocs threatens dollar's reserve function is not an economic forecast. It is an official admission of the end of the unipolar era. This crisis is not the result of natural market evolution. It is the self-inflicted inevitable cost of prioritizing coercion over cooperation. For 70 years, the U.S. plain dollar reigned supreme, not just because of American military might, but because the global financial system built on the pillars of Bretton Woods, the World Bank, and SWIFT was sold to the world as a neutral platform for prosperity. Every nation from ally to adversary agreed to trade in dollars and deposit their wealth in U.S. assets, because they believed the system, though designed in America, was safe, apolitical, and reliable. That trust, the most valuable commodity we possessed, has been systematically and cynically destroyed by Washington's leadership. The core thesis of this crisis is simple. The U.S. weaponized its own currency and financial infrastructure, and the world is now rationally seeking defense. When the U.S. used targeted sanctions to pressure rivals, it was viewed as surgical policy. But when sanctions were suddenly deployed with unprecedented severity against a major global economy like Russia, freezing billions in foreign reserves and instantly severing ties with SWIFT, the message sent around the world was terrifyingly clear. No nation is safe, and the dollar is not a currency. It is a weapon of war. This weaponization shattered the foundational trust that sustained our hegemony. Why would a nation, sovereign and independent, choose to hold its wealth in a currency that could be instantly seized based on a political disagreement in Washington? Why would a country agree to use a payment system that could cut them off overnight? The IMF's warning about deepening fragmentation is their diplomatic way of saying the global divorce is already underway. The historical irony is staggering, a classic case of imperial overreach. For centuries, the Monroe Doctrine, the principle that the U.S. dictates the geopolitical order of the Western Hemisphere, was sustained by military threat. But our financial dominance allowed us to extend this doctrine silently globally. We dictated economic policy through structural adjustment programs and enforced compliance through our control of global banking. By abusing the dollar, we have now done to our financial hegemony what no military rival could ever achieve. We have convinced the entire world that they must find an alternative. The panic in Washington right now is palpable. The financial elite understand that this fragmentation is not merely an inconvenience. It is the existential threat to the American project. The ability to run massive trade deficits, fund perpetual military operations globally, and maintain a high standard of living for our citizens is entirely dependent on the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. If trade and finance truly split into blocs, a Western bloc, an Eastern bloc led by China, and a growing non-aligned global South bloc, that power dissolves. The immediate symptoms of this decline are already evident. Nations are not merely talking about alternatives, they are building them. Russia and China are conducting massive energy trades priced in yuan or rubles. India is bypassing the dollar using local currencies for oil purchases. The expanded BRICS bloc, now including oil giants like Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, is actively working on developing a common trade currency and rival payment systems outside of the Western sphere. This is not a distant threat. This is the active real-time construction of a parallel financial universe. The U.S. has long tolerated geopolitical rivals, but it has never tolerated financial rivals. The creation of this alternative system is the ultimate declaration of asymmetric financial warfare, forcing the U.S. to confront a reality we were entirely unprepared for. Our own self-proclaimed infallibility has led directly to the breakdown of the most valuable engine of our global control. The IMF's warning is the final undeniable proof that the era of financial hegemony is over, destroyed by the very hands that built it. We stand now at the precipice of a global economic realignment defined by the failure of American trust. The fragmentation that the IMF now officially recognizes did not happen by accident. It is the logical consequence of breaking the core mechanism of American power. For decades, our global dominion rested upon three seemingly unshakable pillars: the U.S. dollar's reserve function, the SWIFT payment system, and the perceived neutrality of our financial institutions. The moment we transformed these neutral platforms into aggressive weapons of coercion, their eventual collapse became a matter of historical inevitability. The strategic blunder that triggered this financial divorce was the maximum pressure campaign against Russia, when the U.S. and its allies executed the unprecedented maneuver of freezing Russia's central bank assets and cutting off major financial institutions from SWIFT. The action was intended to serve as a singular crippling deterrent. The calculation was that Russia's economy would collapse within weeks, sending a warning shot to any other nation contemplating defiance. The outcome, however, delivered a devastating reciprocal lesson to the United States. The world learned that economic integration provides no immunity from political seizure. This act proved that the dollar, which nations rely on to stabilize their domestic economies, could be instantly weaponized, making the act of holding U.S. assets an existential liability. It provided the ultimate validation for every nation that had long warned about American financial overreach, from China and Iran to Venezuela and the developing world. The immediate practical effect was a surge in efforts to achieve financial sovereignty, a concept that now drives global economic policy. The nations targeted by U.S. coercion led by Russia and China demonstrated a remarkable degree of resilience and strategic agility. Instead of succumbing to the sanctions, they immediately initiated the process of circumvention, leveraging their collective market size and their control over vital resources. This is asymmetric financial warfare at its most effective. The institutional embodiment of this circumvention is the BRICS bloc, now expanded to include major oil producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Their very purpose has shifted from mere economic coordination to the active construction of a parallel non-Western financial universe. The public discussion of a common BRICS trade currency and the development of rival payment systems are not distant threats. They are the architectural blueprints for the successor to the dollar-based order. On a practical transactional level, the shift is already profound. The dominance of the U.S. dollar is maintained through its mandatory use in global commodity trade, particularly energy. Russia, in partnership with China and India, successfully pivoted these critical energy trades to be settled in local currencies, yuan, rubles, or rupees. India, for instance, used this moment of geopolitical tension to secure discounted oil, bypassing the Western financial infrastructure entirely through complex bilateral currency swaps. Every barrel of oil traded outside the dollar framework is a direct measurable hit to the dollar's transactional mandate. This circumvention is amplified by the fact that the two largest global economies, the U.S. and China, are now actively decoupling. China, as the world's manufacturing powerhouse and a crucial energy consumer, is leveraging its vast industrial capacity to push for the yuan's greater use in trade, particularly within its Belt and Road Initiative. When nations receive loans or trade settlements from China and yuan, those nations naturally increase their yuan holdings, accelerating the creation of a genuine rival reserve currency bloc. The IMF's use of the term fragmentation is therefore an acknowledgement of this self-inflicted wound. The U.S. demanded obedience. The world delivered fragmentation. The panic in Washington is rooted in the realization that this collapse is not cyclical but structural. Our leaders understood that our military could be challenged, but they believed our financial architecture was eternal. The successful resilience and circumvention strategies deployed by our rivals prove that the most reliable tool in the imperial toolkit, the dollar, is now irreparably dull, forcing the U.S. to confront a new reality where its most potent leverage is fading rapidly. This is the bitter inevitable cost of confusing global trust with eternal dominance. The financial fragmentation confirmed by the IMF is not just a technical problem of exchange rates. It is the inevitable consequence of a profound moral trap woven into the fabric of American foreign policy. We have repeatedly relied on the righteous language of democracy, promotion, and human rights to camouflage strategic actions, sanctions, interventions, and financial coercion, designed to maintain access to resources and enforce geopolitical obedience. This hypocrisy has finally exhausted the world's patience and critically destroyed the legitimacy required to sustain a global reserve currency. For the dollar to remain supreme, The world had to believe that the U.S. was a benevolent, if strict, guardian of global stability. But our pattern of intervention has shattered this image, replacing it with the brutal reality that democracy promotion is too often the preamble to resource extraction and state collapse. The financial crisis we now face is the direct result of the world observing the chaos we created, and concluding that dependence on the U.S. system is synonymous with systemic risk. We must confront the empirical record of our attempts to shape the world through force or coercion. The promise of freedom and stability always collapses beneath the weight of unintended catastrophic consequences. The nations of the global South, weary of our dictates, do not need propaganda to justify their push for de-dollarization. They simply need to look at the ruins of our former projects. We sold the invasion under the guise of eliminating weapons of mass destruction and establishing liberal democracy. The result was not democracy, but the total fragmentation of the Iraqi state, the rise of devastating sectarian violence, and the creation of a geopolitical vacuum that directly gave birth to the barbaric horror of ISIS. We left behind chaos, proving that American military intervention guarantees instability, not liberation. Our involvement was framed as a purely humanitarian mission to protect civilians. The consequence was the instant collapse of the state, a descent into perpetual civil war fueled by regional proxies, a massive refugee crisis that destabilized Europe, and the horrifying emergence of open slave markets along the North African coast. We broke a country and walked away, demonstrating that our moral commitment ends precisely where our immediate strategic interests are satisfied. Our persistent attempts to fund and arm opposition movements to achieve regime change turned a regional uprising into a protracted, complex civil war. The result is the death of 500,000 people, the greatest displacement crisis since World War II, and a state now permanently carved up and controlled by external rivals. Our stated goal was political freedom. The actual outcome was prolonged, industrialized suffering. After 2 decades dedicated to nation-building, a project we declared necessary for global freedom, the entire edifice crumbled in a matter of weeks. The historic humiliation of the final withdrawal proved that the sheer hubris of imposing a Western political identity at gunpoint ultimately yielded nothing but tragedy and the return of the very extremist forces we sought to eliminate. In every case, the message sent to the developing world was the same. Compliance leads to dependency. Resistance, while dangerous, offers the only path to genuine sovereignty. The world watched as we froze the assets of Iran, crippled the economy of Venezuela through sanctions, and threatened nations with financial ruin for purely political disagreements. The suffering induced by these economic pressure campaigns, starvation, lack of medicine, collapse of infrastructure was not collateral damage. It was the precise objective designed to generate enough misery for a population to overthrow its own government. This deliberate weaponization of pain under the pretense of democracy promotion shattered the belief in our moral authority. The world does not fear the authoritarianism of Beijing or Moscow as much as it fears the chaos and fragmentation that inevitably follow American intervention. The decision by nations to embrace financial fragmentation and de-dollarization is not an act of hostility. It is an act of rational self-defense. They are safeguarding their economies from the self-destructive cycle of American coercion. The IMF's warning is therefore the final receipt for our moral hypocrisy. It confirms that by consistently prioritizing strategic control and short-term political gains over the long-term stability and neutrality of the global financial system, we have undermined the very pillars of our own hegemony. The age of financial impunity is over, destroyed by the very hands that attempted to police the world's morality while engaging in its most cynical strategic acts. The fragmentation of the financial system validated by the IMF instantly triggers a global reckoning. This crisis is not contained within central banks. It has profound practical consequences that translate into asymmetric warfare against the core interests of the United States. This resistance is asymmetric because it recognizes that military superiority cannot solve a problem created by the erosion of trust. The defense against U.S. hegemony is now fought using balance sheets, trade agreements, and diplomatic coalitions designed to raise the economic and political cost of U.S. dominance to an unsustainable level. The most powerful weapon leveraged by our rivals is reciprocal economic escalation. While the U.S. still commands the world's most formidable military, our adversaries, led by China and Russia, are preparing to retaliate in areas where we are most vulnerable: our domestic economy and our global supply chains. The gradual strategic reduction of its massive holdings of U.S. Treasury securities would signal a catastrophic loss of confidence, driving up U.S. borrowing costs, spiking interest rates, and importing instability directly into the American homeland. Simultaneously, China maintains control over critical global supply chains, particularly the processing and refinement of rare earth minerals essential for American high-tech and defense industries. Any geopolitical confrontation over financial policy could trigger commercial retaliation, demonstrating that military power cannot protect a fragile dependent economy. Russia, having served as the catalyst for this fragmentation, by surviving the maximum pressure campaign, acts as the geopolitical engine for the new non-Western coalition. Russia uses its vast energy resources and military partnerships to solidify economic ties with the global South and with key swing states like Turkey and Saudi Arabia. This is asymmetric diplomacy. While the U.S. offers lectures on democracy, Russia offers discounted energy and security guarantees, allowing these nations to assert strategic autonomy away from Western control. However, the most powerful and comprehensive counterforce is the global South's diplomatic mobilization. Nations across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, weary of being treated as proxies in the American imperial game, are using the IMF report as diplomatic ammunition. They view the IMF's warning as official validation that their long-held fears of U.S. coercion were justified. This legitimacy allows them to mobilize politically, demanding greater representation in global institutions and actively promoting trade settlement and local currencies. Regional blocs like BRICS, SEEK, and the African Union use their collective voice to condemn U.S. unilateralism in the UN, making it politically and reputationally devastating for the USUUS to enforce compliance. This diplomatic solidarity is a cheap yet highly effective tool of asymmetric warfare, denying the U.S. the moral and political cover required to intervene. This global reckoning is not abstract. It translates directly into a tangible threat to U.S. national security and domestic stability. The fragmentation of the global financial system means that the U.S. can no longer rely on the dollar to absorb its debt. The result is imported inflation and economic uncertainty, as the costs of maintaining the empire are suddenly borne directly by the American consumer. Furthermore, the loss of financial control severely weakens our ability to enforce our strategic interests abroad, forcing us to choose between escalating to a military conflict we do not want or accepting a permanent reduction in global influence. The collective asymmetric resistance of the emerging world has cornered the empire, forcing it to confront the reality that its old tools are broken, and the only path forward requires a fundamental, painful change in approach. We are facing the inevitable consequence of a system that believed its dominance was eternal. The fragmentation of the financial system validated by the IMF is not just a problem for economists. It is the final definitive reckoning for the American empire. We have spent the last 3 decades attempting to enforce a global order built on the illusion of our perpetual unipolar dominance. We have seen how prioritizing short-term financial coercion over long-term strategic stability, weaponizing the dollar, freezing assets, and demanding absolute obedience has shattered the very foundation of trust that sustained our hegemony. The consequence is not merely trade wars or diplomatic spats. It is the structural collapse of the system we created. This crisis forces a final, inescapable choice upon Washington, one that defines the difference between a nation that adapts and an empire that crumbles. We can choose escalation. We can ignore the IMF's warning and double down on sanctions attempting to force compliance through brute financial strength. We can threaten to cut off more nations, increase tariffs on countries trading in local currencies, and declare a financial war on the entire BRICS bloc. This path satisfies the political urge for strength, but it guarantees accelerated chaotic collapse. It will instantly justify the creation of the parallel financial universe, destroy the few remaining elements of global trust, and rapidly import massive inflation and instability directly into the American homeland. As the costs of maintaining the obsolete empire are finally borne by our own citizens, we can choose humility and strategic realism. This path requires the courageous recognition that our immense power is not unlimited and that the era of financial impunity is over. It demands a pivot away from perpetual coercion toward genuine restraint and diplomacy. It means weaponizing the US dollar, committing to the neutrality of global financial institutions, and accepting that the world is inevitably multipolar. We must seek to lead through cooperation, investment, and example rather than through command and threat. This is not weakness. It is the ultimate demonstration of strategic maturity and the only sustainable path for American longevity in the new multipolar world. The empire's long, slow decline is not irreversible, but the window for course correction is rapidly closing. The IMF report is the mirror reflecting our own